Were the Crusades the Christian equivalent of the Islamic Jihad?
That defeat is a major one for the Byzantine Empire. They lose a good half of what's left of their empire now, and there are no other really Christian powers left in the world except for Western Europe. The First Crusade, I always say, was it's the only time in human history that I know of in which tens of thousands of men march thousands of miles deep into enemy territory for no good strategic reason. They don't have a plan. They don't have any idea where they're going. They have no familiarity with these areas. They just know that God wants them to do it, and they just keep marching. But the Crusades, it's very interesting. The Crusades in the Middle East, nobody really understood what the Crusades were when they were happening. But
Really?
no, because it was too little.
Welcome to Scholars Unravel the Middle East. I'm Adel Ali, your host. I was born in the Middle East, but grew up in America, where I practiced patent law and later founded a startup based on my own inventions. And then I went on to my ultimate passion, history, its lessons, shocking surprises, wow moments, and its myths and mysteries. To deep dive into history, I go to the source. I interview scholars, 150 and counting, passionate and preeminent scholars who have spent decades researching primary sources and writing about history. And my goal for this program is to correct our misperceptions and misconceptions about the Middle East, this fascinating region with its long and remarkable history. My guest is Dr. Thomas Madden. He's a professor of medieval history. He's the author of many books, including the following. First, The Concise History of the Crusades. Second, The Fourth Crusade, The Conquest of Constantinople. Third, The Fourth Crusade, Event, Aftermath, and Perceptions. And fourth, Enrico Dandolo and the Rise of Venice. This is part one of my two-part conversation with Dr. Madden. In this interview, we discuss the following. Were the Crusades the Christian equivalent of Islamic Jihad? Was the First Crusade in response to a call to help Constantinople against the Turks, or a call to free Jerusalem from the Arabs? Why did Europeans, the common folk, give up their lives and march to unknown lands and unknown peoples in the Middle East without any plans or provisions? Why did this man carry a letter from God? And why Dr. Madden calls him the rock star of the 11th century? Are there any relations between the medieval Crusades and the challenges of modern Middle East? Were the Crusades essentially a battle of civilizations? And finally, why the Middle Easterners didn't really know about the Crusades until the 20th century? So, stay with me as Dr. Madden and I unravel the Middle East. Dr. Madden, it's a pleasure to have you on our program. Thank you for taking the time for this conversation with me.
My pleasure.
Were the Crusades the Christian equivalent of the Islamic Jihad?
They're both in both cases. It's a holy war, but there are pretty significant differences. I mean, the case of Islamic Jihad, that Jihad is understood as something that is necessary for the faithful. Crusades were never they're only developed in the 11th century, and they're never something that's required by. In fact, only a very tiny minority could actually take part in them. But the core idea of the Crusades as a holy war also had components to it that were uniquely Christian. The concept of that what they were doing was a penitential act. They saw it as an act of charity and of love for their neighbor. And so by doing that, they were trying to do something that was salvific for their souls. but it was not something that was required of them.
Is
Quite the
that what you
contrary.
mean by penitential salvation for
Yeah,
their souls?
yeah. I mean, in Christian theology, in the Middle Ages, and still for Catholics today, when one sins, one one receives both there's an eternal penalty and a temporary penalty for that. The eternal penalty would be hell, obviously. The temporal penalty is penance, and one can confess sins and receive absolution, but there's still a penance that's due for those sins. Now, if you're just a regular person, you lied to your wife or something like that, then, a penance is pretty simple, a few prayers or something like that. But the nobles of Western Europe are a warrior aristocracy. They literally, their job is making war. And so if you've wiped out a village, um, you can be forgiven by God, but your penance is going to be pretty heavy. Uh, if you do not complete that penance in life, you have to do it after life. So you may die with confessing all your sins, but if you have not done all the penances for your sins, then you have to do those penances after you die. And that's what the development of purgatory is. They would go to purgatory and they would then have to do those penances, which could be extensive. Today, when Catholics talk about purgatory, they tend to kind of talk about it like a waiting room or something, where you're just kind of waiting to get into heaven.
Yeah.
Um, in the Middle Ages, I can tell you, it was fire. It was a terrible place. You did not want to be there.
So
And
purgatory was kind of like a prelude to hell, to the
well,
hotter
except
fire, if you will.
except you would go to heaven. It was temporary. So
I
you would
see.
be there for a while for doing that penance. So if you're a warrior, the nobility knew that they had stocked up enormous amount of penance. And there were things you could do. You could give alms to the poor. Many of them would give lands to monasteries. The idea of a monastery is that they're praying for your soul even after you're dead, which can help. Um, but but it does mean that the very act of what you do in life is itself causing you to rack up these penalties. The crusade, because it was called in reaction to a call for help from the East, the Emperor Alexius Comnenus in the Byzantine Empire and Constantinople had asked the Christians in the West to come to their aid against the Turks, who had conquered most of Asia Minor. And and that call to come was seen as a penitential act. It was an act of charity. So the noble who took the cross, who made the vow of the cross, he would be putting forth an enormous amount of his own wealth. It usually cost about 3 times or 4 times the annual income of a noble to go on a crusade. So he would use enormous
Wow,
amounts of.
that's a huge sum.
Oh yeah, it was a lot. Um,
Okay.
so an enormous amount of money, enormous expense. Usually it would take them about a year to put everything together that they needed to go on a crusade. And then, of course, the mortality rate was about 50%. So you had a very good chance of never returning.
I, I
But
had I had
yeah, go ahead.
lined up a question to ask you about motivation. Why did Europeans do this? But I think you answered this. It has to do with penitence.
Yeah, I mean, there were other factors in this too. Particularly in the First Crusade, they were told about what was going on in the East. They were told about Christians. The Turks, when they had come in the 11th century, had conquered a big section of Asia Minor from the Byzantine Empire, which was Christian. But they had also conquered the Holy Land from and Jerusalem in 1073 from the Arabs and that meant that the Holy Land now was in really bad shape. It was incredibly chaotic, very, very dangerous. There were a number of pilgrims that had been killed. A lot of churches had been desecrated. So all of that was something that they wanted to do the penitential act, but these are warriors, and they see themselves being attacked in what's going on with these Christians in the East. So there's other motivations as well. They want to right this wrong
I
uh,
see. A
against the
couple of
Turks.
clarifying questions, please,
Mhm.
Dr. Madden. Uh, when you were talking about the jihad, and then you went on to the Crusades, and you said the 11th century. What I deduce from that is that the jihad in Islam is kind of like the core. It was there from the beginning. Am I correct in that assessment? Versus the Crusades, that sort of holy war aspect came later in Christianity.
Yes, that's right. The
Okay.
jihad really begins in the earliest days of Islam during the time of Muhammad. Muhammad is waging jihad from Medina against Mecca. And so much of the concepts of holy war are worked out in those years
Hmm.
of the time of the earliest period of Islam. Also, Islam, like most world religions, is closely bound up with the state right from the beginning.
Yeah.
Uh, um, at both at Medina and at Mecca, Islam becomes not only just the religion, but it's also the state. And that's something that's not true for Christianity, obviously. Early Christianity was certainly not a state. In fact, it was persecuted by the state.
Exactly.
So,
That takes
oh,
several centuries to happen for it
many,
to.
yeah, many centuries. It's
Yeah.
not really until the conversion of Constantine that you begin having now Christianity interacting with the Roman state. So Christianity it has a big catch-up game to when it's having to deal with statecraft. So, for example, I mean, St. Augustine, for example, in the fourth century, writes a lot about this because
Hmm.
there's a lot of Christians have questions. I mean, am I allowed to serve in the military? I mean, uh, are Christians allowed to be warriors?
And I think St. Augustine, if my memory of what I've read is correct, he actually says war is okay if it's defensive, or the second point, to take land back. Does he says something to that effect?
Yeah, I mean, if it's defensive, I mean, that he develops the concept of the just war, that it has to be done by a legitimate authority, that you have to have tried other means short of war, to have settled the problem.
Hmm.
Um, and so, right, so he accepts that that warfare may be necessary sometimes, and therefore lays out the principles of the just war that will inform Christian history after that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Similarly, with the question of can a Christian be a soldier? In other words, are you committing murder every time you kill someone? And he says, no, it is perfectly honorable for a Christian to be a soldier. And he points out, for example, John the Baptist has a warrior, a centurion, come to him and ask him how he can live a better life, and he tells him, "Don't extort people." He doesn't tell him, "Quit your job."
Exactly. Don't be a soldier. And so this is really interesting because St. Augustine and later Christian theologians are dealing with this fourth century and on, versus in Islam from the very early days. This is not a discussion. This is settled matter.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Now,
I
I
see.
mean, jihad means struggle, and it was understood. They talk about what's called the greater struggle and the lesser struggle. The greater struggle is the internal struggle, the struggle to be a better person, to live a good life. The lesser struggle is the military struggle against the enemies of the faith.
The
Uh,
lesser struggle. That's
yeah,
interesting. Yeah.
yeah. But I gotta to be frank. I mean, in the Middle Ages, virtually every Muslim writer who's writing, when they talk about jihad, they never mean the greater struggle.
They
They
mean the
always,
lesser struggle of
yeah,
war.
yeah.
Interesting.
They mean war.
I told you I had two clarifying questions to ask you, please. The second one is this. You mentioned Turks several times, and they're very important to Middle East history.
Right.
Now, most Turks have been absorbed into the Arab world, with the exception of obviously Turkey and Azerbaijan and parts of Iran. But these Turks, they're not necessarily Ottomans at this point.
No.
Okay, yeah.
No,
Still,
that
go ahead, please.
these are Turkic tribes that originally came from the steppes, most likely the Caspian Sea area, and they had come. They're Indo-European people. They're not Arabs, but they had uh, been converted to Islam. And when they came into the region, they're very warlike. When they came into the region in the 11th century, they conquered much of both into the Persian areas. They conquered Baghdad, Damascus, and then came into the Near East. So they're conquering Muslim territories, and that's and then they move. They're waging jihad against the Christian Byzantine Empire. And so after the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, they defeat the Byzantines, and pretty much all of Asia Minor, what's today Turkey, is opened up to them. That defeat is a major one for the Byzantine Empire. They lose a good half of what's left of their empire now, and there are no other really Christian powers left in the world except for Western Europe. Everything else is over the last several centuries have been conquered by Muslim armies. So when the Byzantine emperor is looking for help, he doesn't have a choice. The only people to ask are the Western Europeans, and
Yeah.
so that's what leads to the Crusades. He sends a message to the Pope, Urban II, and he asks for help. Can you send me somebody to help me to reclaim these territories that have been conquered, and to help free the Christians who have been captured, and undo this attack.
Yeah. So at this time, when you say Turks attack and win a major battle, the Byzantine Empire is essentially reduced to Constantinople and areas west of that in Europe proper, right?
Yeah, they're by this point they pretty much just have Constantinople, so the Thracian areas,
Uh-huh.
Greece, and they have a little bit on the very tips of Italy, but that's about all they have
That's
left.
all I have. Um,
So actually, by this time, they don't even have that anymore. The Normans have taken the tips of Italy, so really that's all they have left, um, and uh, they're in a big bind. So that's why they're asking for help. Now, I should say the Emperor Alexius Comnenus, he never expected a crusade. He was expecting just some troops. Probably he was expecting mercenaries.
some sort of
He
military alliance for mercenaries. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Byzantines regularly purchased mercenaries. They had no, there was they were definitely had lots of money, so he was perfectly willing to pay. But instead, he got 30,000 soldiers pouring down on his city in Constantinople, and this was not what he had really bargained for.
That
So
probably caused havoc.
yeah, he was in a
Um,
way trying to manage this whole thing.
you just said 30,000 soldiers. Okay. And a few minutes ago, you talked about the motivation of Europeans. That conversation, that discussion was focused on the nobles,
Mhm.
how in Europe you had essentially warrior aristocracy. I prepared these questions with your book in mind, which is titled "The Concise History of the Crusades." And one of the things that I noted, the masses that went to the Middle East for the Crusades. So let's go back to this nobles, the cost and their motivation. What about the average Joe in Europe, some middle class, or even worse, a poor person? One, how could they afford to go to the Crusades? And what is their motivation? And when I use the term middle class, I appreciate, by the way, that that may not really apply to medieval Europe, but still, like a dad with kids and a shop, they would close that down and go to the Middle East to war.
Yeah, when the first call for the First Crusade went out, when Pope Urban II made the call at the Council of Clermont, and then preachers preached that afterwards, he had made clear that this was for the nobles. This was for the
Oh,
warriors. That those who had the means to do this, should do so, but that clergy, women, the elderly, the poor, they should not go on the crusade.
But how do you
Now,
make up 30,000?
right now, it's one thing to say it. It's quite another thing that because these preachers would go out, and there was a kind of a revivalism kind of flavor to a lot of these crusade preaching, and they would go out and they would tell the stories about these atrocities that are being done to Christians, that all these things, these horrible things that the Turks are doing in the East, and they would often describe this as Christ being crucified again in the
Oh,
sufferings of his
wow.
people. So Christ is he it's like he's being crucified again because his people are suffering, and he's calling to you to come and help him. And these were images that were very strong. And so and also in the medieval world, the concept was essentially that if you are on the side of good and God is on your side, then you will always win. And so if you are clearly doing this because God wishes it against those who are harming his people, then you can't lose. And so that's for that reason, there were lots of people, particularly in the First Crusade, where you had just common people who started signing up. This was particularly true with one preacher named Peter the Hermit, who was very charismatic. This guy was the rock star of the 11th century.
Rock
Uh,
star. I love it.
he
What
would
country
ride.
was he from?
Sorry,
What modern country would he be from?
Peter the Hermit from France.
France. Okay.
But he rode this ass, and he rode it all around Europe. He had a letter from heaven. Many of these preachers had letters from heaven, and he would go around and preach the crusade. He was very popular. Now, many nobles took the cross, but they were told that they were given a year. They were all supposed to meet the following year in Constantinople. So they were given a year to get things together. It's an enormous process to put everything together, not just the money that they needed, but the men they were going to be bringing with them, their other feudal vassals, engineers, other types of things that they would need. So they're busy. But if you're a common person, you're a peasant, or you, as you say, a shopkeeper or someone like that, and you're hearing these and you're really affected by this,
You're fired
and
up.
yeah, you want to join. Well, you don't have any reason to wait. There's nothing for you to fix. You don't have any vassals. So these people just kind of started following Peter the Hermit. And so as he went, he kind of collected this whole thing. Traditionally, this is
Oh,
what's known
wow.
as the People's Crusade. And um, and so, although the main body of the crusade is spending its time preparing throughout 1096, uh, the People's Crusade that's following Peter the Hermit, it just marches off to the east and and makes its way into Hungary, and then further east, heading to Constantinople. Well, this was a major problem because, for the most part, most of the people on this crusade, and it's usually figured at maybe 10,000 people. Uh, Most of the people in this group didn't really have funds.
Yeah,
Uh,
who fed them supplies?
right. That's the
Yeah.
question. So if you are in a kingdom, let's say in Hungary, and suddenly this mob comes,
Yeah.
and they don't have the money to buy food, they're just going to take it. So you either fight them or get out of their way, or give them some food so they'll keep moving and not cause more damage than they're already doing. So this thing ultimately, it makes its way to Constantinople, causing pretty much mayhem the whole way. Once they arrive there, the emperor, who thought very highly, he thought very highly of Peter the Hermit. not so
This
much
is the
as a
same emperor that had called Alexis for
yeah,
help. Okay.
yeah, Alexius Comnenus, yeah. But he urged them to wait uh, for the main body of the crusade that was coming the following year, but they didn't want to wait. And besides, they didn't have any money, and because they didn't have any money, they were in the suburbs of Constantinople, so they would just steal the food they needed. So
Wow.
that didn't go over very well. So finally, Alexius just had them ferried across the Bosphorus where the Turks were,
Oh no.
and let them go fight the Turks.
With
Well,
what?
well, they had some weapons, but
Yeah.
mainly the Turks had no idea. The Seljuk Turks had no idea that anything like this was happening. So they had a short little victory where they were able to steal some horses and livestock. But once the Turks figured out what was going on, um, then it was pretty quick. They basically entrapped them and completely destroyed the that whole body of Crusades. In
That's
fact,
both fascinating and tragic.
yeah, nobody survived it
Wow.
except virtually everyone was killed except for, I mean, those people like young men, women, children who could be sold on slave markets, they were taken. A few people who agreed to convert to Islam, they were allowed to live and they were taken. Um, the only person really who survived unscathed was Peter the Hermit. And
How
that
did
was,
the culprit, the guy that got everyone fired up,
yeah.
how did
And that
that
was
happen?
because he had gone back to Constantinople to talk to the emperor when everything went down. And so he wasn't even there.
Oh wow. Dr. Madden, you know, these Europeans are coming to the Middle East. You have the Crusades getting fired up, and people and the nobles are coming. I'm going to ask you a question in a minute that we have left, a question that could fill 10 book volumes, but I'll ask it anyway because it just, I think it's very intriguing. Can we can we categorize the Crusades, just the whole thing generally, as also kind of like a battle of civilizations? Would I guess another way for me to ask this is this: would the Crusades have happened anyway had not Christian uh, holy places were not in the Middle East? Well, they wouldn't be Crusades, I guess. They wouldn't be called that. But would this clash occur anyway? What do you think?
Yeah, I think so.
You think so?
Yeah, because it would not have been exactly the same way, obviously,
Mm-hmm.
but um, prior to the First Crusade, in the end of the 11th century, um, the Christian world had three-quarters of the Christian world had already been conquered by Muslim armies over the past 4 centuries. So
Wow.
there at some point the Christian world was going to was going to fight back. They would mount some defense. And now in Western Europe, at this point, they most people in Western Europe, particularly during the 9th, 10th, 11th century, they didn't have much understanding of what was going on in the rest of the world. Um, but by the 11th century, they do understand it, and they understand that there have been all of these conquests. And so at some point, the Christian world was going to have to try to defend itself. And so in the macro level, the Crusades are really that defense, an attempt to try to
Interesting.
stop these conquests and even initially to roll them back.
Oh
Um,
wow, that's fascinating.
and in fact, the First Crusade was amazingly successful. The First Crusade, I always say, was it's the only time in human history that I know of in which tens of thousands of men march thousands of miles deep into enemy territory for no good strategic reason. They don't have a plan. They don't have any idea where they're going. They have no familiarity with these areas. They just know that God wants them to do it, and they just keep marching. And one of the reasons why the First Crusade is successful against the Turks is that they don't understand it either. They don't know who these people are. Why are they here? Why are they here from so far away? This has nothing to do with them. There's also no familiarity with their fighting style because they come from so far away. So the Crusade, First Crusade benefits uh, from that surprise that anybody would come that far. It's not like they're getting, I mean, initially their plan was just to conquer these territories and give them back to the Byzantine Emperor. And that's what they do at Nicaea.
Yeah.
They recapture Nicaea, which was the capital of the Seljuk Turks, uh, and uh, and they give it back to the Byzantine Emperor. But then, as they go on to make their way to the Holy Land, um, they it's the whole. I mean, it's a fascinating subject, but it's always on the brink of utter destruction. And for some
The
reason,
European armies or the Holy Land? You're talking
the
about the
whole
European.
the First
Yeah.
Crusade, they're always on the brink of destruction, always just about to be destroyed. At Antioch, everyone assumed, in fact, the, they have massive problems with desertions because people just think there's no way we're surviving this. And they just take off. Peter the Hermit deserted. So,
What a guy.
I mean, they caught him and brought him back. Uh,
Uh,
but yeah,
that's
a lot of people just figured there was no way they were going to survive. But something always ended up happening and they turned it around. So they conquered Antioch, um, and then they marched south through Syria and down along the coast to get to Jerusalem.
and
And
it seems
again,
like the Middle East was in disarray, and the Turks didn't know, as you were saying, what's really happening. Who are these mercenaries, or who are these people?
yeah,
Um,
they had no concept of it. Mostly time they just thought they were Byzantine mercenaries,
yeah,
and they had no concept of who these people were. But also, the Crusaders benefited from the fact that the Turks and the Arabs, well, the Turks were at each other's throats anyways, but the Turks and the Arabs were also at each other's throats. And and just as the Crusade had come into the region, the Arabs in Egypt had just reconquered Jerusalem from the Turks.
is that the
And
Fatimid dynasty?
yeah, the Fatimid dynasty,
Yeah,
yeah.
okay.
And so they conquered Jerusalem. They send word to the Crusaders saying, "Rejoice! We've taken the city back from the Turks. You guys are free. I mean, welcome to come here as pilgrims again." Um,
Seriously? Oh,
yeah, and
wow.
the Crusaders, they're like your average anchor person at a news thing today. They don't know the difference between Turks and Arabs. They're just all Muslims. They don't care. So, from their point of
Oh,
view,
wow.
that's irrelevant to them. But as the crusade is marching south, as they come to these various Turkish emirs who control these cities, when they ask them where they're going and they say, well, we're going to Jerusalem, we're going to conquer Jerusalem. Well, they know that the Arabs are in charge of Jerusalem because they just took it. So they're like, oh, fine, go ahead, go beat up the Arabs.
Oh,
You
so the
need any
Turks are giving
food?
them free passage.
Yeah. So
Oh,
they just
wow.
literally just
Interesting.
walk down. So again,
Wow.
they take advantage of all of these situations,
Wow.
and ultimately in 1099 they're successful. They conquer Jerusalem.
Let's take a break here. Stay with me and Dr. Madden as we get into the perspective. Dr. Madden, I've read many explanations about how Europeans benefited from the Crusades by being exposed to Middle Eastern science, culture, wealth, etc., etc. Is the reverse true as well? Did Middle Easterners benefit from the Crusades, from that contact?
No, and actually I don't think that the Western Europe actually benefited that much either.
Oh,
uh,
okay.
it's kind of a misconception that the Crusades were a big benefit. There are some things that they benefited from. It opened up some trade routes for them. Certainly, the Italian maritime states did well because they transported a lot of pilgrims, and so that certainly helped them. But aside from that, um, in the Holy Land, in the Crusader states, uh, the Christians were always the minority there. There was still a Muslim majority, And but even still, even though they lived together and they would be friendly to each other, but there wasn't much interaction as far as culture
Oh,
or religion. They didn't really understand each other's religion very well at all. Um, the Christians mostly considered Muslims to be idolaters, which is doesn't make sense at all. And the Muslims generally just called the Christians polytheists. So
really? But
yeah.
Muslims knew about Christianity. Their holy book, the Quran, has a lot about Jesus and Mary and all of that, right?
Right, but they consider them polytheists because they worship God the Father, God the Son, and God the
Oh,
Holy Spirit, and they view Jesus as
interesting.
God, which Muslims do not. Muslims see Jesus as a prophet. So,
I see.
so they just didn't really. There wasn't a lot of interaction. Now, it is true that Western Europe would benefit from things like Arabic math, Arabic numerals, science, but almost all of that comes through Spain.
Also,
Yeah,
it's not coming from the Crusades, let's say
no,
the Levant and
no.
Anatolia. So, fast forwarding to our current time, do you think there's a relationship between these medieval crusades and the problems of modern Middle East? I know that's a big question, but
It is, and it's one, particularly in the aftermath of 9/11, I used to be asked a lot by journalists that question, and my
after
answer,
9/11, that's interesting. Okay.
yeah, because if you remember after 9/11, Osama bin Laden was talking about the Crusades a lot, uh,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
and so I did a lot of media after 9/11 because I was one of the few Crusade historians in America who was
yeah.
active. Um, the the short answer is no. The Crusades have absolutely nothing to do with the current state of the Middle East. The Crusaders' footprint in the Middle East ended in 1291 when the last of the Crusader states was destroyed by the Mamluks in Egypt. Uh, the profile of the Middle East, the what created the modern Middle East, really has to do with the centuries that followed that, which is the rise of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire, based in Constantinople, is what spread throughout the Muslim Middle East and became the superpower of the Islamic world. The sultans in Constantinople became the caliphs of Islam, and all of that territory was under their control. And then the situation in the modern Middle East today uh, develops after the breakup of the Ottoman Empire after World War One.
Yeah.
But the Crusades, it's very interesting. The Crusades in the Middle East, nobody really understood what the Crusades were when they were happening. But
Really?
no, because it was too little for them. From the grand scale of the Islamic empires, Western Europe was too little, and these battles were too small. They just didn't think they were that important. They used to just call the Crusaders Frange, which from their Frange was what their hearing of the word Frank, and um, and
Oh,
they approached them as not even having their own agency. They saw them as just something that God was sending them because they were sinful and disunified, and that God was going to take them away as soon as they stopped doing that.
Dr. Madden,
So
this is crazy. So the Crusades is this big part of European North American historical consciousness, and you're telling me that it really is not that way in the Middle East.
not at all. Well, it wasn't. It wasn't.
It
Um,
wasn't.
yeah, up until the 19th century, you couldn't find anyone in the Middle East. In fact, the first Arabic language history of the Crusades was written in 1899. There had never been any understanding of the Crusades or what they were. There, again, I often use the example of, let's say, if you ask the average American about the Mexican-American War, they couldn't tell you anything about it. They don't know
Really?
anything about it. It's too small.
Oh,
But
that
if you ask
is
Mexicans about it, they know all about it. Um,
That is
it's a
fascinating. So
very simple, it's very similar. The Western Europe poured their hearts and their souls and their money and their lives into the crusade for centuries, and they ultimately failed. Um, but in the Islamic world, they were just a minor thing that didn't really affect them that much, and
most
so they
Muslim
didn't really
countries
die.
probably had more problems with the nomadic tribes of the steppes and the east and
Yeah,
Turks.
they were just one more little thing that was going on in a big giant area.
Oh, that
Where the
is
where the
fascinating.
where the modern Middle East learned about the Crusades was in the colonial schools that
Oh,
Europeans placed there after the fall of the Ottoman Empire. It's a fascinating. Carol Hillenbrand is the great scholar of this. She's emeritus at University of Edinburgh, but she wrote this brilliant, groundbreaking work called "The Crusades: Islamic Perspectives," and she looks at the entire history of Muslim understanding of the Crusades. And she has a whole section at the end too, where she describes kind of how Muslims learned about the Crusades in the modern era. Muslims in the Middle East learned about them in the modern era, and they were taught about them from Europeans.
that is fascinating. In the next segment of our conversation, we'll talk about the Fourth Crusade, a
Okay.
crusade in which Christian crusaders fought and killed other Christians.